This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. Glad, as always, to be joined by my friend, economist, Dr. Bob Murphy. How you doing, Bob?
I'm doing good, Jeff.
Well, a lot going on this week. Got a lot of play, a lot of feedback on our episode on woke Disney last week, and I thought we'd continue in this strain of what's going on in the corporate world. And the big news, I guess, since we last spoke was Elon Musk, billionaire, oligarch, maybe, perhaps, purchased a big stake in Twitter. He's now about a 9-something% shareholder. And vis-a-vis our conversation about Disney, I want to add, of course, guess who the next shareholders are after him? Vanguard, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, State Street. So it's kind of the same story in terms of the big shareholders. But nonetheless, he's now the single biggest individual shareholder, and that earns him, among other things, a seat on the board. I'd like to know more about how this was structured. I mean, we all know, actually I didn't know, some Twitterati pointed it out to me that he'd sold another chunk of Tesla stock back in December, about $1 billion worth. So presumably those sales are how he came up with the capital to purchase this something like almost $3 billion worth of Twitter stock. But nonetheless, that's a pretty big enchilada any way you look at it. And I guess, Bob, the single biggest, most impactful thing he could do, which would probably make progressives hate him forever and ever, would be to reinstate Trump on Twitter. That would be a serious game changer.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's obviously the single worst thing he could do from their point of view, and then just poke a finger in their eye. I mean, this whole thing it plays out the way it naturally does. People, hey, it's a private company. Twitter can do whatever it wants, and so then someone says, okay, well, I'm going to acquire some shares of it. It's a private company. I can do that, and then all of a sudden, oh no, that's you can't do that. It's a public square. So it is funny how people's positions on what the argument they deploy depends on, how is this going to turn out for me today, and does it support what I like?
I don't understand why Twitter can't simply be totally unadulterated. On your feed, you see all the tweets of everyone you're following chronologically, and that's it. And those tweets are not, and those Twitterers are not suspended, mucked about with in any way, unless, I suppose, they had, really virulent criminal type, child pornography or something like that, or, maybe really, it's a private company, maybe really virulent, incredibly hateful content. But beyond that, I mean, Twitter should be no different than a blog, right? You should see the people you're subscribed to, and that's it. This idea that there's algorithms and some stuff boosted and some stuff is diminished, it drives me absolutely crazy. It's not their role.
Yeah, I think I guess, because I ran into this. I mean, not that I'm in the same even universe, let alone zip code as Twitter, but like when I had my own blog, and then people would make comments, and in the beginning, I said I'm not going to edit or curate the content at all, because if I go in and selective, then that means there's always the borderline, like what's the most offensive comment that you let remain, and so if you're editing them, then it's like, oh, so you're okay with someone saying such and such, where what I mean. So it does get in there, but then after, like, some people would leave really reprehensible things that was just like, no, I don't want someone going to my website seeing that on there. Like, it would just ruin their day, and you know what I mean? And it'd be a bad experience for people. So it is tricky. So I now, yes, with Twitter too, like the ability to kind of filter, but then it's like, oh, well, people retweet it. I understand what you're saying, but I could see how it's certainly, I think we can all agree where they've drawn the line is completely wrong. And it's ridiculous, that they still have, the Communist Party or something. I didn't go and verify, but that's one of the talking points going around Fox, that certain, dictators around the world can still tweet, but Donald Trump can't. I mean, obviously that's ridiculous. But yeah, it is tricky to know, like, what's the way to get it just right. Or, if everyone just seeing who they follow, maybe the argument is, oh, but then there's not enough variety. Like, you actually do want to get some stuff in there. Like, you would like this person if you never but you wouldn't even know he existed unless we kind of, showed him to you.
Well, I don't want variety. I want to see the people that I follow. And of course, they can retweet other people that I may not follow, and I may see it that way, and that may broaden my horizons. But I think there's a distinct difference between Twitter and Bob Murphy's blog in the sense that you're not purporting to be any kind of public space or public platform. You sort of are curating your own thoughts and your own audience. And if there's some commenter on your blog who's just incredibly vile and ruining the experience, I think that's different because on Twitter we have block and mute, which I think are valuable and viable functions that ought to exist. I'm not so sure about whether edit ought to exist. I'm kind of two minds on that. But Twitter is different than your blog, and Twitter is holding itself out as a company that provides a platform to engage in conversations and to allow average people in a more democratic sense to have a say that they don't have when they send a letter to the editor back in the day, to the New York Times or something like that. So, I think there's probably some amount of material that has to be kept off Twitter just because there are crazy, violent, hateful people out there who really are beyond the pale. But I think for the most part, I don't want any editorial function whatsoever, any curation whatsoever. I just want to see my feed, and I don't know if that's possible. And I can accept ads. I can accept promoted tweets, right? They have to have a business model. That's fine.
Right.
But here's the thing about Elon Musk, and as I said, he's now the single biggest shareholder. So let's talk about him a little bit. We all know that Tesla, the main source of his wealth, at least his paper wealth, his stock wealth, and he did realize some of that by selling it, so it became actual wealth in his hands, I suppose. Some of the money they make is a little untoward. And I went and I just pulled actually a really good, rigorous Business Insider article from last December about the extent to which Tesla and SpaceX and Solar City, which are all of his companies which he owns or controls, are subsidized. And as libertarians, we make a distinction between tax credits and subsidies, but nonetheless, we'll just use that term in its broader sense today. So, of course, we all know, among other things, there's a $7,500 tax credit to buyers of EVs. So first and foremost, that makes the cars he sells, gives them a competitive advantage against old school combustion cars. But, SpaceX has a bunch of really big hundreds of millions of dollar contracts with NASA. So that's a big deal. I was unaware that Tesla took PPP loans, about $600 billion worth, during the COVID period of early 2020, I guess March of 2020. Tesla avails itself of big environmental credits, which it sells and trades in. So those are beyond the individual EV tax credit. And this was totally unknown to me. A few years ago, they got almost a $500 billion loan from the Energy Department. And of course, some of the other, the Gigafactory that they created in Nevada, there were a lot of tax credits and subsidies by the state of Nevada. So it's not all federal. Some of their other facilities have received preferential treatment from the various states in which they find themselves. So, you put all this in a blender and you say, well, from a pure market perspective, not all of the Tesla share price was arrived at through purely kosher market means, and therefore not all of Elon's personal wealth, which is mostly Tesla stock, by the way, it's SpaceX stock, was arrived at in a market manner. So I tend to like the guy. I tend to admire the guy. Bob, should we view him as a brilliant market entrepreneur who's simply playing the system as it is, or should we view him the way we view Russian oligarchs who arrived at least part of their wealth in an untoward fashion?
I think he's probably a borderline case, on that spectrum. So you're right. It is tricky. Like if somebody's talking about Walmart or something, and then there's certain purist, agorist libertarians that will just go through and explain all the ways that Walmart's horrendous and like this vile creature of the state. And there's some that like the fact that it's a corporation, any corporation per se. There's some purist libertarians that say, see, that's So yeah, I think you run into a danger of doing that. I suppose ultimately I would want to see the particular and see what Musk has to say, about those things. But is it like you're saying too, Jeff? There is a distinction between, and I'll just say it in case some of the listeners haven't heard it, like a tax credit, meaning money that the government, the IRS says you owe them, and then you don't need to pay as much because you have this offsetting credit, versus money that the federal government is actually giving you. And so for a lot of economists or just accountants in general, they treat the two as interchangeable. Like, hey, money's fungible, and what's the difference? But from a rights theory perspective, it's a completely different thing to say the government's allowing you to keep more of your money versus the government's taking money from other people and giving it to you, and through a genuine subsidy. So there is that element as well. I don't know if this lines up with your recollection, Jeff, but I want to say like 10 years ago, Elon Musk was more a hero on the left, and there were a lot of right wingers who just grumbled about him, and they resented the image he had sort of like even just using the term Tesla and whatever. They resented that and thought, he's this spoiled guy who couldn't he couldn't turn a profit in a genuine free market, and so and the left liked him because of all the space stuff, but also of course just electric vehicles. So he was a darling on the left, and then I guess it was just because he started sharing his political views that's all of a sudden why everything changed. Sort of like most American evangelicals didn't like Kanye West until all of a sudden he became Christian, and then all of a sudden it was, he's had a hard life and he knows the streets and stuff. So it is interesting how people's views, can flip based on the politics.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there's a couple things that have happened over the last 10 years is, yes, I think the left loves electric vehicles, and desperately wants them to be the mainstay, if not just ban combustion engines in this country. And so he was a hero in that sense. But also in the last 10 years, I think his past associations with Peter Thiel and becoming wealthy off of PayPal going public, that was less discussed. Peter Thiel wasn't, before Trump, Peter Thiel wasn't known as much and reviled as deeply by the left. And so now, when we have this information made public, which is that Elon Musk was part of a team that joined with PayPal. There are two competing companies, actually an interesting story, and that this was the original source of both Peter Thiel and Elon Musk's wealth was selling PayPal. And then they both made a bunch of good investments and started a bunch of companies with the money since then. So those are big things. And, the two things that progressives want in this country, well, two things, not the two things, but two things they want very badly are electric vehicles and choo-choo trains. They can't get enough of this choo-choo train thing, this public transportation thing, which only works in really big, dense urban areas. It's never going to work in Dallas, Texas, or far-flung Los Angeles to Riverside. But nonetheless, they persist with this. So yes, he was a hero. But here's what I want to get into a little farther.
Well, if I could just jump in. So to answer, I realize I didn't fully answer your question. Yeah, I do think he's a genuinely very smart guy. He's not just, bluffing, and it's not just he's a glad handler and, knows how to shake hands or something. Like, yeah, I do think he's a genuinely smart guy, and probably in any regulatory environment, he would have done well for himself. Would he have this much wealth? It's always hard to answer questions like that, because in an alternative universe, I think everybody would be fantastically wealthier than they are now. But yet, would the extremes be there? It's hard to say. So, maybe he would be worth more, but the average person would also be a multimillionaire, in Rothbardistan. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, I think there's no question he's brilliant. The question is whether he's corrupt. And I think guys like him, like Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, you could put, some people are just incredibly brilliant and talented, And you could put them in any environment. You could put them in the former Soviet Union and they'd rise to the top of the Communist Party. You could put them in a mixed economy like ours and they'll play the regulatory capture and subsidization and political lobbying game to the extent they have to and become wealthy and successful. You could put them in the kind of Rothbardian free market economy maybe we'd like to see, and they would be extremely successful in that. So some people are just smarter and better than other people. And that that goes to this concept of oligarchs, which has been in the news a lot lately. Which has become sort of this catch-all term to mean a Russian billionaire we don't like. Oligarchy has a dictionary definition, which is basically rule by the few. But I think in most of our minds, it has a broader conception, which is that people who obtained wealth and political power in untoward ways. And surely a lot of Russians did so coming out of the former Soviet Union during that sort of fog of war. They were able to snap up formerly state assets on the cheap and sell them later for many, many multiples. And some of them end up owning, Chelsea Football Club in London and big yachts in Croatia and that sort of thing. And so we understand that. We understand, I think, as liberty-minded people, that not all wealth is the same. And some of it is obtained corruptly. But we never seem to apply that term to Americans, right? Is Michael Bloomberg an oligarch? Is Elon Musk an oligarch? Is Jeff Bezos an oligarch? I mean, if we look at this sort of mixed review of how they got rich and the amount of political power they have, I mean, clearly America is run as an oligarchy, and virtually every country on earth is. There's always going to be a set of elites who amass a lot of political power and wealth to themselves. I mean, I'm increasingly think of the mind that when we talk about political liberty, what we're really talking about is how well are average people able to live in a country, right? Average people, a robust middle class, I think, is the hallmark of a more free and functioning society. So if you're talking about let's say a poor third world country in Africa where a dictator strips all the wealth from the country or from the citizens in a parasitical manner and sends it all to a Swiss bank account or to the Caymans and has Mercedes and private jets for himself. I mean, that's oligarchy at its worst. And then when you look at a country like the United States, yes, we have an oligarchic class in media, politics, business, government, arts and entertainment. But nonetheless, average people are able to live far better here than they are in many parts of the world. So we're a bit of a mixture on that. But I think it's pretty telling that the media doesn't use the term oligarch to refer to American billionaires. So why do you think that is, Bob?
Well, I think it's a couple things. So one is that a lot of them would be ones that the media likes. You know what I mean? So left-wing billionaire, as we said in a previous episode, they're philanthropists when they're, contributing to causes. The Carnegie Endowment for the Arts or blah, 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 and, NPR is like, this is supported by a grant from such and such. Like those, the Ford Foundation, stuff like that. That's all great stuff because it's, it's pro-democracy, obviously. So it couldn't be oligarchy. So I think there's that element. Also, I think just in general, even though it's this weird thing that, I'm curious your reaction, it still seems as if the American narrative is that every other country on earth is capable of doing really wicked things, but the U.S. government, even if it's bombing civilians, that was just an honest mistake. Or, we're trying to help, and sometimes, the bombs go astray. Like, it's never that the U.S. government, even though the narrative also says, for 4 years we had the next Hitler running the show. And yet still the U.S. government is basically good. And I think they need to have that in there to get both what they want, that they need this American state to have tremendous power, like to regulate healthcare and education and, reform the world, to form a new world order. And so in terms of the military, they want to have that. And so it can't, you wouldn't want people to realize there's a chance that oligarchs might be corrupting our system. But yet at the same time, too, that when a Republican or a conservative or right-winger comes in, we got to be able to completely ostracize and demonize that person. So I think that's what's going on. So that in that context, then you wouldn't want to talk about American oligarchs, I think, because then people might say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should limit the power of our state. if there's oligarchs afoot, that we wouldn't want them to get control of these levers of power. And so, perhaps that has something. But I definitely agree with your observation that, nobody calls them oligarchs. It's interesting, though. I don't know if it was on your radar. I think it was in 2014. This academic study came out, and these professors said that the United States is technically an oligarchy. It's not a democracy, which was funny because it's not supposed to be a democracy anyway. It's supposed to be a republic, but still, and that was making the rounds. And I think you're right. Also, I was surprised, Albert J. Nock, Our Enemy, the State, that author, I forget I think the term he used is he called the United States the first merchant state. I think that was the term so he was saying more than any other government, he obviously was writing in the past, but he was saying in terms of it's the United States where wealth really carries the most purchase with, no pun intended, in terms of what politicians are going to do for you. And it wasn't at Scarface too. It was like, in America, first you make the money, then you get the power, or something like that. And then you get the women. Was how he concluded that. So it's I think it's ironic that you would think of anywhere on earth where does money buy you the most influence. I think it would be the United States in that sense, as opposed to other sorts of connections. Now, again, having said all that. And to your ultimate point, though, like so if elites, especially the wealthy, always are going to have more influence than the average guy, really what's the protection is to have the rule of law, and so that the organs of power are, there are limits, and that's really ultimately the best safety for an individual. So in a totally free, libertarian type world, a rich person who's accused of murder is going to be able to hire the best lawyers and whatever, but if it's a decentralized system, and the judges all have to make their business by reputation, and they're not just appointed by the government. Like, oh, this is my jurisdiction, this is my case. There, it would be limited. So yes, you'd rather be rich and be accused of murder than being a homeless guy accused of murder. But the amount of unfairness and the discrepancy wouldn't be as big, I would say, in what you and I would call a free society.
Well, and of course, we shouldn't care about inequality per se. That's a goofy progressive shibboleth. And there are a lot of honest progressives who will tell you, yes, they would accept a United States, for example, that was 10% poorer across the board if that remaining wealth was distributed more equally across society. They'd tell you that in a heartbeat. They'd give up economic growth. As sensible people, we should reject that and say, well, we don't care about inequality per se unless that unequal distribution is actually causing or impoverishing people in the middle and lower rungs of an economy and society. So in America, we should care about how average and less affluent people can live. That's what we should care about, not inequality per se. So here's something interesting talking about oligarchs controlling everything. I found there's a left-wing site called Quartz Comrades. So anyway, they had done some work around Thomas Piketty's data in Capital in the 21st Century, looking at income inequality, not wealth inequality in Russia, today's Russia, but income inequality is a proxy of sorts for wealth inequality. And so they went back and looked at the old Tsarist period and said, back then, the top 10% owned about half the income in Russian society, and then that went down to 25% during the Soviet era, during the Communist Party rule. So that's a good thing, apparently. But then now, under the new cronyist, Putinist oligarch rule, it's back up to the top 10%, having 50% of the income in Russia. And so they compared this basically to the United States, where it's about the same, roughly. The top 10% have about half the income at least. And so, I think America is an oligarchy in that sense, but average Americans live far, far, far better than average Russians, where there's the per capita GDP, average per capita GDP even today in Russia is only about $10,000 a year, folks. So, that's on par roughly with Mexico. I mean, we don't and oddly, we don't think of Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, it's only about $4,000 a year. So we don't think of these as third world countries. We think of them as Eastern Europe, but, from an income perspective, they are. So you look at this and you say, well, if this is almost inescapable, regardless of what kind of system you have, this unequal distribution, Even in a libertarian world, you would have this tremendously unequal distribution. I think we have to look at this politically and say, well, what's the cause of it? Is there a natural elite, to use the Hoppian term, or which to me would signify people who deserve their wealth and influence society because they've earned it, or they have natural attributes, intelligence, drive, personality, charisma, whatever it might be. And all those things are distributed by God quite unequally, apart from whether you're born a rich kid. Okay, all these other things, ability, intelligence, these things are not distributed equally. That's just the way of the world. What we ought to be striving for is a system where, okay, we're going to have elites, but do we suffer under them parasitically? Are they bad guys or girls? Or do we have good, what Hoppe calls natural elites? That makes a lot of progressives uncomfortable, that term, that anything can be natural. And it makes a lot of libertarians uncomfortable. They don't like Hoppe, and they don't like that conception, which he teases out in Democracy of the God That Failed. He also has a standalone essay, and we'll link to it in the show notes. It's called Natural Elites, Intellectuals, and the State at Mises.org. So here, Bob, he's talking about the idea that, well, yeah, there can be such a thing as natural elites in a marketplace. And so give us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, you raised a lot of good points. Just real quickly, the Piketty stuff, it's when that first came out, a lot of people were saying, oh, yeah, his data is completely solid. Some of his conclusions, though, we don't. And then Phil Magnus and I went in and looked at it, and it was shocking just how shoddy some of those data sets were. And so it's, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know that the curve would have been as pronounced in reality as he may have, like that, because that serves his narrative that, oh yes, under communism, things. So just I would warn people. We can link folks at the show notes page for this episode we're doing. I'll send you that stuff. But it's more than I would have thought. Like just him making up numbers and stuff when he didn't have data points. It was really incredible.
But good intentions are all that matter, Bob.
Right. But just so people realize what I'm saying, like he was doing stuff like telling a history of the United States minimum wage laws, where under Democrats the minimum wage always got raised and Republicans didn't, and he was just wrong. Like in several places, like no, the minimum wage was raised under a Republican, and he just his years were wrong. Like that's kind of a big deal if he's like supposed to be this historian economist. So anyway. I think you're right, and I do agree with Hoppe's view that yes, I mean this is kind of the basics of what you want. That under a laissez-faire, there are very ambitious people, very competitive, driven, and you want them laying awake at night wondering, how do I make my product more appealing to my customers? How can I shave costs? You don't want them laying awake at night thinking, okay, if I bribe this guy, maybe then they can have an FTC ruling against this competitor, or depending on this, or this, have the secret police disappear this guy over here, and then he's not bothering me. I can plant this evidence against him, say he talked out against Stalin. So that's there are going to be people driven who want to succeed, and you're right, whatever the environment is, and so the goal is, or what you should do is, what kind of society is going to be the most conducive to the general welfare, to use that phrase. It's going to be where the rules have it such that the most ambitious, talented, driven people are thinking, how do I better serve my fellow man or woman? And that, ironically, is what a genuine laissez-faire system does, at least in the marketplace.
Yeah, and the left is not buying that at all. They think the idea that an individual striving, they would call it grasping, money grubbing, to increase their own material wealth, and the fact that they do so through voluntary market mechanisms, which we would go so far as to view as noble. That this person, the idea that naturally spills over into a widespread general benefit for society, they would just dismiss out of hand.
Well, it's funny because, I mean, again, it depends who you're talking to. Like if someone is an outright communist, Marxist, they're fair enough. Like, in other words, what they recommend does kind of line up with what their worldview is. But for people who claim to revere democracy, when you say to them, oh, well, what happens if like real driven, bloodthirsty, competitive people try to take over and they're power hungry? You say, oh, well, we'll just vote them out. right? So they understand the system that, there can be institutional checks and balances and ways that if the people aren't being served, that we get rid of the bad apples. And yet for some reason, so that it just boils down to, okay, which system do you think is more likely to check somebody? Like one where the person who gets in charge is in charge of the police and the courts and the nuclear weapons and so on, or the one where the person in charge is in charge of Twitter. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so you can see how, like with distributed power, it's this weird how they think elections are the ultimate dam, right, or filter by which will stop any sort of corruption or oppression. And yet the competitive marketplace, oh no, come on, these companies have way too much power, and yeah, a worker can quit, but what kind of leverage do they have? And yet, well, when the Soviet Union, when the Soviet government is in charge of where everyone works, what kind of leverage does the average comrade have? They're just not being consistent.
Well, in part, this is the entirety of public choice theory, right? The idea that these same incentives will apply to government. I think it was Milton Friedman speaking to, I want to say Phil Donahue, and forgive me if I'm wrong in my memory, where he basically said, where will you find these angels, paraphrasing, who will run government but not business? And that's the question, I think.
Yeah, and it is. So and I understand it is true sometimes free market advocates, they laud the benefits of the marketplace and, and these hero entrepreneurs, and it might look like, the fact that someone makes money, means that he's a great guy, per se. And yes, the real thing is human nature is what it is. And the more cynical you are, it's not that you should therefore favor a stronger state to go punish these bad guys and make sure that they don't, go out and have racist hiring policy. Like that's a good example. The more racist a society is, the less power you would want the government to have, because the more powerful the government is, then that means the majority can more easily impose their policies on the minority. And so if the alleged, problem is, or, for the purpose of the discussion, is that the majority is very critical of or not caring about the rights or the viewpoint of a minority, then you don't want a powerful state. That's the last thing you want. And yet most progressives, they would think it's the other way around. It's precisely in that arrangement where we want a powerful state to come in and, stick it to those racists.
Well, so in Hoppe's essay, when he's talking about natural elites, I thought this was interesting. I found this from the Britannica online encyclopedia under the oligarchy definition. It says Aristotle, there we go, used the term oligarchia to designate the rule of the few when it was exercised not by the best, but by bad persons unjustly. So it doesn't necessarily, in Aristotle's sense anyway, just mean that, there's a small cohort of powerful people in any society, but it's they're the wrong people and they're exercising their power unjustly. So Hoppe posits that no, you could have the right people exercising their power justly, but this requires that we almost view elitism through a meritocracy, or through the lens of what he calls natural elites. And if there's one thing you get out of this essay, Bob, and it's such a sticking point, it's just getting beyond this obsession with inequality. I mean, and maybe this is the fundamental distinction between what we think of very broadly as left and right, is that some people just can't get beyond inequality, which seems to arise time and time again. And the more you muck with things, to the extent of even creating a communist state, it just intensifies it and creates a true oligarchy. And so I don't know how we get past this. Doug Casey says, well, maybe there's just some sort of different wiring in the brain. I hate to think of that some people, care more about wealth and some people care more about inequality, But I don't know how we're ever going to sell this idea to folks who are just steeped in this idea that inequality is the dragon to be slayed, because any conception of natural elites is going to result in inequalities, just hopefully more benevolent ones.
Yeah, well, I think like Bakunin even has a famous essay where he's talking about authority, and I'm paraphrasing here, but saying something like, do I reject all authority? No, when it comes to boots, I defer to the authority of the bootmaker. and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So he's saying, and we could broaden that, like, geez, did so-and-so really prove Fermat's last theorem? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to defer to the mathematicians. And then, well, how do you know who a mathematician is? Just someone who says I'm a math? No, you can go and see who's got degrees and who the peers, like that kind of stuff. So there's ways in civil society, yes, we have hierarchies, if you want to use that term too, of authority figures. And certain people can say, hey, was Einstein right or wrong? Well, we don't know. You would probably, and some said maybe you wouldn't defer to the authorities because stuff has been politicized too, like with climate science. Just because a bunch of people at MIT say something, actually, I've researched enough to know that isn't going to be conclusive to me. So obviously, with all these things, it's ultimately, in your own head who you're going to think the authority figures are. But the point is, yes, when you go to live your life, mostly what you're doing is relying on authority figures telling you, this is how it is. I trust that my car's not going to explode when I get in there, and that's partly because I'm trusting, the mechanics down the street and whatever. So you're right. You actually, it doesn't even make sense to say, could we have a society where there's no authority figures if you define it in that broad of a sense? And obviously, the question then is, okay, well, given some people are going to have more influence on your car's oil change than others, which ones? Well, the system should be such that the people who have expertise in that area tend to be the ones making those decisions, and also that they have skin in the game. That if they're wrong, then their life is made more unpleasant in some way, so that they have an incentive to not be wrong. And so you say that seems like common sense stuff, but it's the other way around when it comes to the state intervention. Like my favorite example is when there's a plane crash. 100% sure the FAA is going to get more money in the next budget period. You know what I mean? And then if you think that through, that is the most perverse thing. Like the fact that they didn't do their job is evidence they need to have a bigger budget. And yet in the private sector, it's the other way around. If one particular fast food restaurant has a food poisoning outbreak, it's not that all of a sudden they say, well, we need to get more customers because we don't have enough money to hire, no, they go out of business or whatever. And that, if you think about it, that's systemically the way to contain problems, is not to just have one agency in charge of this issue, and when they screw up, they get a bigger budget. That's perverse, and yet that's how state intervention works when it comes to regulating social issues and how do we have authority deployed through the state mechanism.
Well, that's why I think it's so important to point out that democracy, so-called, doesn't solve oligarchy, right? It just creates a permanent bureaucratic managerial state, because I think it was Michael Malice who pointed this out. Even if you have the most direct democratic form of government, like super localized, town hall every Tuesday night to vote on whether we're going to have this viaduct on Main Street and how we're going to pay for it and this, that, he said, even that, it has to have an organizer. It has to have someone run the meeting and set the ground rules for the meeting procedurally, or the parliamentary rules. It has to have time limits. It has to, so all of these things, there's always going to be a cadre of people running things. Now, maybe they're not super wealthy as a result of that. We think of an oligarch as being a wealthy person, not just a politically connected or powerful person. But nonetheless, I think if you read the left, if you read The New Republic, if you read Mother Jones, these types of magazines, they really believe that oligarchy, autocracy, these are anti-democratic rule by elites, and that the solution to this is more robust democracy, more democracy. But we've seen that democracy doesn't solve this at all. It just creates it transfers elite status to a different kind of person, in my opinion, a worse kind of person than the kind of people who would go out and have success in the marketplace versus the political world.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. This is a point that I've made a few times, that the way what especially progressive leftists in the United States context, what they mean by democracy is good government. They don't actually mean democracy.
Right.
So, for example, when Trump was president, if he had been going around and stump speeches and saying, CNN's fake news, right, and then they had a resolution to say CNN should lose its licensing and not be able to broadcast. And if 65% of Americans agreed with that, everybody would flip out, on the left for sure, would flip out and say this is completely anti-democratic, even if it did have 65% of the population supporting it. You know what I mean? And so what they mean by democracy is good government, the kind of government we like, where people get to speak out, so long as it's against right-wing politicians. They don't mean, get to say, I think boys are boys and girls are girls. No, you can't say that. That's not what we mean by free speech. So it is, they have their own rules and so forth as to what they mean. But yet, again, so for them, democracy is just the term meaning good government or government we like. And it doesn't actually mean the literal, historical definition, classical definition. It
doesn't mean when Viktor Orban gets the most votes, by the way. It doesn't mean when Brexit, which people forget, had 70-something% turnout and won pretty handily by a good solid point or two. It doesn't mean that, we know. So I guess I'll wrap up the show with this. When we think of oligarchs, it doesn't necessarily only mean a strong man like Vladimir Putin. It can mean a guy who single-handedly buys the CIA organ known as the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, or it can look a lot like Tracy Flick in Election, the earnest, striving Politico who wants to control her school by being student body president. I mean, that person goes on to plague your city council, to become a state rep, to become a U.S. rep, to become a senator, and God knows what else. So all that said, think about this. Does America have oligarchs? I think it does. So, Bob, I want to thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back with another one next week. We've got a very special guest, which I will announce shortly on that. So you're not going to want to miss next week's episode. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Jeff.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.